Antelope chose the fence gap like it had been measuring that ranch line for weeks, learning where the wire sagged, where the posts leaned, and where humans stopped looking because they thought a fence meant done. The gap wasn't obvious from the road. From a distance, the perimeter fence around White Mesa Ranch looked straight enough. 5 strands of wire, weathered cedar posts, a few metal T-posts where repairs had been quicker than pretty. It ran over a low rise, dipped into a sandy wash, then climbed again toward the windmill and the water tank. Tourists driving by would have called it sturdy. But animals didn't read fences like tourists did. Animals read fences like maps. And this particular gap sat at the worst possible place for a rancher's confidence. A shallow bend where the fence crossed an old game trail. Years of pronghorn and mule deer had funneled through that spot long before any wire was stretched across it. The ground there was packed harder, dust rubbed smooth, and the grass grew differently, shorter, more bitten, as if the land itself expected traffic. Caleb Dyer knew the place existed, which made it worse. He'd seen the sag 2 months earlier when he was checking the line on an ATV at sunset. He'd told himself he'd come back with a stretcher and new clips, fix it properly. Then hay season hit. Then a water pump failed. Then his kid got sick for a week. Then it was always tomorrow. The fence gap stayed. And now, early on a bright fall morning, it had become a doorway. Caleb was in the yard by the barn, loading mineral tubs into the bed of his truck, when he noticed something that made his hands stop moving. The ranch dogs weren't out. That alone was strange. They had 2 working dogs, Boone and Nix, both half heeler, half something Caleb didn't ask questions about. Those dogs lived for motion. If a gate creaked, they appeared. If a truck door shut, they were at the bumper. If Caleb so much as looked toward the pasture, they acted like the day's purpose had arrived. This morning, Boone was on the porch, chin on his paws, eyes half shut. Nix lay in the shade of the tack shed like it was the laziest day of summer, not crisp fall with a breeze that made every scent sharper. Caleb frowned. "You too sick?" he called. Boone lifted his head, looked at Caleb, then put his chin back down. Nix's ears flicked once, but she didn't get up. Caleb felt a little chill of annoyance, not at the dogs, exactly, but at the feeling that something was off, and he hadn't been told. Working dogs didn't just decide to skip work. If they stayed home, it usually meant they didn't think they were needed, or they didn't want to go where the job was. Caleb climbed into his truck and drove out along the ranch road, dust rising behind him in a pale ribbon. The morning sun made the mesquite look silver, and the air smelled like dry grass and distant water. Cattle grazed lazily in the north pasture, heads down, tails flicking. Everything looked normal, until he reached the fence line. He stopped at a gate and stepped out, scanning the perimeter the way he always did. Posts, wire, corners, any sign of fresh pressure. He walked a few meters along the fence and saw hoof prints on the ranch side of the line. Small, neat, paired like a heart shape. Not cattle. Pronghorn. Antelope, people called them, though Caleb knew the technical truth. Pronghorn weren't true antelope. Out here, nobody cared. They were antelope because that's what the land had always called them. Caleb crouched and touched one print. Fresh. The edges were crisp. Then he saw the gap. The top wire strand was fine. The middle strands were fine. But the bottom strand, the one that mattered for Pronghorn, because Pronghorn didn't like jumping, had been pushed up and bowed slightly. Not broken. Lifted. Like something had slipped under it smoothly, using exactly the space it needed. Caleb looked closer. The bottom wire had a slight sheen where hair had rubbed. A few tan fibers clung to it. His jaw tightened. "Dang it," he muttered, more at himself than anything else. Pronghorn weren't a disaster on a ranch the way feral hogs were, but they weren't harmless either. They could spook cattle at a bad time, knock into a weak gate, and they always found the greenest patches you were trying to save. They also brought attention, because once one pronghorn used a gap, others learned the route. Caleb followed the prints inward, stepping carefully so he didn't crush the pattern. The tracks led across the pasture in a straight, confident line toward the stock pond area, exactly where his cattle liked to linger during the day. And that's when he saw the antelope. It stood near the pond's edge, head lifted, ears forward, a pale tan body set against the blue sky like a clean cutout. Its white belly and rump patch flashed bright in the sun. It didn't look panicked or lost. It looked like it belonged there. Caleb stopped in the open and watched. The antelope watched back, not like a deer that was ready to bolt at any human shape. This one held its ground, assessing distance with calm math. It took one step, then another, not away, but sideways, keeping the pond at its back and the open field in front like a runway. Pronghorn were built for speed. They weren't built for fences. That was why they hated jumping. But give them a gap, and they moved with confidence. Caleb scanned the pasture and saw more movement. A second pronghorn farther out near the salt bush, then a third near the fence line, all inside his property now. A small group. Caleb exhaled through his nose. "Okay," he said quietly, as if speaking gently to the situation would make it simpler. "So you're in." Back at the truck, he grabbed a pair of binoculars and looked for cattle reaction. The cows closest to the pond had lifted their heads, ears rotating, but they weren't running. That was good. Caleb didn't want a stampede over a few pronghorn. He also looked back toward the ranch yard, where Boone and Nix would normally be tearing across dust to meet him if they'd been brought along. They weren't here. Caleb realized then what the dogs already knew. Pronghorn were not a herding job. Dogs couldn't work pronghorn the way they worked cattle. Pronghorn didn't bunch. They scattered and outran, and a dog that chased them could end up miles out, overheated, useless. Smart dogs learned which jobs were worth the sprint. The ranch dogs stayed home because instinct told them, "This isn't our fight." Caleb, however, didn't have that luxury. His fight wasn't with the pronghorn themselves, it was with the gap that made entry easy. He walked back along the fence, eyes tracing where the wire bowed. He could fix the wire right now, tighten it down, add a clip, shove a stake under it. But if the pronghorn were already inside, sealing the gap might trap them, which could turn minor nuisance into panicked animals slamming into fence until it bleeds. Caleb didn't want that. He wanted them out first. He stood near the gap and looked across the pasture to where the pronghorn group was spaced out, heads lifting and lowering as they fed. He needed a plan that relied on pronghorn behavior, not brute force. Pronghorn preferred open sight lines. They trusted speed more than cover. They moved along known routes. And they were cautious about narrow spaces unless they already believed the space was safe. This group believed the gap was safe. That meant the gap was his exit too. Caleb walked slowly into the pasture, not straight at the animals, but in a wide arc that gently shifted their comfort. He kept his arms low, posture relaxed, walking like someone who belonged and had nowhere urgent to be. Predators rushed. Calm humans walked. The closest pronghorn lifted its head higher and stepped away, drifting in the direction Caleb's body suggested. Toward the fence bend, toward the gap. Caleb continued, patient, steering with angles rather than chasing. A pronghorn trotted a few steps, then stopped and looked back. Caleb stopped too, giving it space, letting it decide it wasn't being hunted. The animal's ears flicked. It resumed moving, this time a little more willingly. Slow pressure, no panic. In 10 minutes, Caleb had the small group loosely oriented toward the fence bend. Not bunched, pronghorn rarely bunched like cattle, but trending. He could see the gap now in their line of travel. If they remembered it as a safe passage, they might choose it without realizing he was guiding them at all. One of them did. A smaller pronghorn, maybe a juvenile, approached the bend, sniffed the air, then dipped its head and slid under the bottom wire like it was stepping through a door. Smooth, practiced, almost elegant. Caleb held his breath, then released it slowly. Two more followed, hesitating only briefly. The last one, the one Caleb had noticed first by the pond, paused. It turned its head and looked across the pasture one last time, as if taking inventory of what it had gained. Then it walked toward the bend and slipped under the wire, tail flicking once. They were out. Caleb stood alone in the pasture, the sun warm on his neck, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a problem reduced instead of exploded. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt lucky that it had gone smoothly. Now came the part he couldn't put off anymore. He knelt at the gap and pressed the bottom wire down with a gloved hand, testing tension. It sprang back slightly, stubborn. He dug into his toolbox and found a fence staple and a short piece of rebar he used as a quick anchor. He drove the rebar into the ground at an angle, then looped wire around it to pull the bottom strand tighter to the soil. He added a clip to keep the sag from returning and tamped dirt around the base, making it harder for anything to lift the strand again. It wasn't a perfect rancher's repair. It was a today repair. Caleb stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, then looked out across the fence line where the pronghorn had returned to the open country beyond his pasture. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They had learned the route. If the gap stayed, they'd use it again. If it didn't, they'd test another place. That was how pronghorn lived, by testing. Caleb climbed into his truck and drove back toward the yard, dust curling behind him. When he pulled in, Boone finally lifted his head again, and Nix stood and stretched like she was waking from a nap. Caleb looked at them and shook his head, half amused now. "You knew," he said. Boone's tail thumped once, slow, as if agreeing. The ranch dogs stayed home because they understood pronghorn weren't livestock you could boss around, and the antelope chose the fence gap because it understood something Caleb had let slip for too long. A fence only mattered where it held. Caleb thought fixing the bottom wire would end the story, the way people always wanted a repair to be the ending. For 2 days, it almost was. He didn't see pronghorn inside the pasture again. The cattle stayed calm. The pond edge stopped showing those neat, heart-shaped prints. Boone and Nix returned to their normal routines, patrolling the yard, racing the truck to the gate, acting offended if Caleb left without them. Caleb allowed himself to relax, which was usually when the land reminded him not to. It happened on the third morning, after a night of wind that rattled the corrals and pushed tumbleweed against the fence line like someone had been stacking them on purpose. Caleb woke to the sound of the water trough float clicking, then to something else, an odd, steady tapping outside. Not a peck, not rain. Hooves. He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch. Across the yard, Boone was standing still, ears forward, body stiff. Nix was beside him, tail low, focused. Neither dog barked. That was the first clue. The second clue was the way the cattle in the near pasture were all facing the same direction, heads up, as if watching a silent parade. Caleb followed their gaze toward the fence bend. There, on the outside of the wire, stood a pronghorn buck. He was close enough to see clearly. White throat patch, slender black horns with the small forward prong that gave the animal its name. He wasn't in the pasture. He wasn't trying to slip under the wire. He was simply standing at the repaired spot and tapping the ground lightly with one hoof. Tap, tap, like he was checking. Caleb's stomach tightened. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. Pronghorn didn't usually work a fence the way some animals did, but they were observant. They learned patterns fast. If one animal had found the gap once, others would return to confirm whether it was still there. And this buck looked like the kind of animal that didn't give up easily. Boone took one step forward. Caleb raised a hand. "Leave it," he said. Boone stopped. He didn't look happy about it, but he stopped. Caleb walked out toward the fence, slow and calm. The pronghorn buck watched him, but didn't bolt. It pivoted slightly, keeping its distance, staying in the open where speed was always an option. When Caleb reached the repaired section, he crouched and examined it. The wire was still tight. The rebar anchor held. The clip was intact. But on the ground beside the anchor, the soil had been scraped. Not from cattle hooves, not from wind. A neat little excavation. Someone had pawed at the dirt, testing whether the bottom strand could be lifted again. The scrape wasn't deep, but it was fresh. Caleb exhaled hard. The pronghorn buck tapped the ground again, a little farther down the fence line now, as if demonstrating that it wasn't attached to one exact spot. It was evaluating the whole bend. Caleb stood and scanned along the fence in both directions. And there it was, his third clue, the one that made irritation flare into real concern. About 20 meters away, where the fence crossed a sandy wash, a tumbleweed had piled up overnight against the bottom wire. The tumbleweed pressed the wire upward just enough to create daylight beneath it. Not a big gap, but pronghorn didn't need big. They needed consistent. Caleb's chest tightened. He could almost hear the animal's logic. If the wire lifts here, it can lift somewhere else. Keep testing. He walked toward the wash and kicked the tumbleweed away. The wire snapped back down, but not perfectly. The wash was softer ground, and the fence posts there leaned slightly from years of water flow. A weak point. Caleb felt his own fault line show up in his thoughts. He had repaired the place that embarrassed him, the bend he'd ignored too long, but he hadn't strengthened the system. He'd patched one hole in a net and assumed the fish would stop trying. The pronghorn buck took a few steps along the outside, then paused again, ears forward, as if waiting to see what Caleb did next. Caleb spoke under his breath, half to himself, half to the animal. "You're not even hungry," he said. "You're just stubborn." Boone let out one short, frustrated huff. Nix didn't make a sound. She had the stillness of a dog that understood her job was to watch, not chase. Caleb realized something then that made him look at his dogs differently. They weren't staying home because they were lazy. They were staying home because they had learned that pronghorn were a boundary problem, not a pursuit problem. Dogs could run. Pronghorn could run farther. If the dogs chased, they'd lose. If the dogs didn't chase, the pronghorn kept calm enough to test fences and slip through. Either way, the solution wasn't canine speed. The solution was fence design and human consistency. Caleb walked back to the truck, grabbed a pair of fencing pliers, and then did the job he should have done the first time. He started walking the line, not just the bend, the entire stretch from the windmill down to the wash and back up to the rocky rise. He checked every low point where sand collected and could bury the bottom wire, every high point where the ground dropped away and created space beneath, every place a tumbleweed could catch and lever the wire upward. As he walked, the pronghorn buck shadowed him from the outside, keeping distance but maintaining interest, like a curious neighbor watching someone fix a door it had hoped would stay loose. Caleb found two more weak points within 15 minutes. One was a sagging section where a T-post leaned outward, creating extra slack in the bottom strand. The other was near a gate corner where the earth had eroded slightly, leaving a shallow dip. Neither would be noticeable to a passing truck. Both would be obvious to an animal that lived at fence height. Caleb tightened, restapled, and added quick anchors the way he had at the original bend. He cleared tumbleweeds and made a mental note to start doing it daily during windy season. He even placed a few rocks along the lowest dips, where the ground fell away, not as a real barrier, but as a visual and physical irregularity that made slipping under feel less smooth. When he finally reached the far end of the stretch, he stood and rolled his shoulders, sweat cooling in the morning breeze. The pronghorn buck had stopped following. It stood farther down now, watching from a distance, still outside the fence, its body angled as if ready to move on. Caleb stared at it for a long moment. Not angry, not admiring, just acknowledging. "You'll be back," he said quietly. The buck flicked its ears and trotted off, light as wind over grass. Caleb turned to head back toward the yard and found Boone and Nix behind him, having followed at a distance despite his earlier "stay." They weren't running ahead. They weren't trying to charge the fence. They were simply present. Boone looked up at Caleb as if asking, "Did you fix it?" Caleb huffed a small laugh. "I fixed it for today," he said. On the way back, Caleb's phone buzzed in his pocket. No signal out here most days, but near the yard he caught a bar. The message was from his neighbor, Sherry Dalton, who ran the smaller ranch to the west. "You got pronghorn in your north pasture? Saw a group running the line this morning. My dogs won't go near them either." Caleb stared at the screen. So it wasn't just him. He typed back with dusty thumbs. Had them inside once. Patched a gap. Now they're testing everywhere. Wind-piled tumbleweeds lifted wire in wash. Might be a bigger movement. A minute later. "Yep. They're doing it up and down the valley," Sherry replied. "Maybe new herd pushed down from the flats." Caleb slipped the phone away, thinking hard. If a larger group had moved into the area, fence testing would increase. What had been a small nuisance could become a season-long pattern. And if pronghorn learned that ranch fences were inconsistent, tight in some places, loose in others, they'd keep probing until they found the easiest passage again. That afternoon, Caleb drove to the feed store, not for feed, but for materials. Extra clips, 2 rolls of smooth wire, and a bundle of fiberglass step-in posts used for temporary fencing. The clerk raised an eyebrow when Caleb piled the posts onto his cart. "Running a temporary lane?" the clerk asked. "Something like that," Caleb replied. Back at the ranch, Caleb set up a simple addition near the most vulnerable sections, especially the sandy wash where tumbleweeds love to collect. He ran a low, smooth strand of wire a few inches off the ground inside the existing fence, supported by the step-in posts. It wasn't electrified. Caleb didn't want to turn the whole perimeter into a hazard for wildlife. He wanted a second line that made the slip-under move less clean and less predictable. Pronghorn hated awkward. They wanted a smooth duck-under, not a double-wire puzzle. Boone and Nix watched from the shade like supervisors. When Caleb finished, he stepped back and assessed. From a distance, it didn't look like much, just a slightly denser barrier at ground level. Up close, it changed the geometry. Caleb felt cautiously satisfied. That night he made a decision about the dogs, too. He didn't need them chasing pronghorn. He needed them staying alert to fence pressure, so he adjusted his routine. Instead of letting Boone and Nix ride out on every check, he kept them at the yard and gate areas during the hours pronghorn were most likely to move, early morning and late evening. Not because dogs could stop pronghorn, but because dogs could tell Caleb when something had changed. A bark at the wrong time meant, "Go look." The next morning, before sunrise, Caleb walked the line again, headlamp bouncing. The fence held. The extra low wire in the wash remained intact. No fresh scrapes at the bend, no new tracks inside. He stood at the repaired gap spot and looked out over the open country where the pronghorn moved like pale ghosts at distance. Boone and Nix stood behind him, quiet, not eager, not lazy, just aware. Caleb realized then that the story wasn't about Antelope outsmarting dogs or ranchers. It was about a landscape full of lines humans drew and animals tested every season without emotion. The pronghorn would always look for the easiest passage. The ranch dogs would always choose the jobs they could actually win, and Caleb, if he wanted fewer surprises, would have to stop thinking of a fence as a single repair and start thinking of it as a living boundary that needed attention the way water and weather did. Because on this land, anything you didn't maintain became a gap eventually, and pronghorn were experts at finding the moment it happened.